welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hazen. Coming up on today's episode, Keegan DeWitt. He's a film composer who's has some great collaborations with directors like Alex Ross Perry and Aaron Katz and Brett Haley. And his next movie is All the Bright Places. It comes out on Netflix this upcoming Friday. But first up, what I watched this week, I had a war movie week with my dad, where my dad, as a boomer, you might imagine, he loves his war movies. We had a conversation a few weeks ago where he was telling stories about my grandpa who was in Europe during World War II, and I started realizing that my dad's love of war movies comes from this one area that he could actually worship his dad, specifically. But it was funny because it showed he and I have had this ongoing conversation the last maybe year or so, because we both like completely opposite ends of the spectrums, what we expect from a war movie and movies in general. And I was telling him about the Francois Truffaut quote that all war movies there's no such thing as an anti-war movie because they inherently romanticize or inspire more soldiers. All war movies do in some degree or not. They make it look violent and sexy in some way. And so I started talking about examples that I thought might break it. And I mentioned, Come and See, which I don't think he'll ever see. But I mentioned Criterion posted this essay from David Simon, the creator of The Wire, recently, where he talked about Pass of Glory. And that was his pick. He mentioned the Truffaut quote in the essay, but he mentioned that because Pass of Glory fixates so much on the bureaucracy of the generals that there's on top of Kubrick's bleakness, there's no way you can really look at that movie as in any way pro-war. So Dad and I got together this week at one point and finally got around to watching it. And my dad, after finishing it, all he could really say was he liked it, but he just thought it'd be more action. So later in the week, he picked a one that he'd normally see, not so much that it's an anti-war movie, but just a war movie that he likes a lot, that he's been buying these very movies I've never heard of off eBay. And he found this one called The Lost Battalion. And it's this A&E movie directed by Russell Mulcahy. He's directed Highlander and The Shadow and I think one of the Resident Evil movies. And it was an A&E TV movie starring Ricky Schroeder. And it's basic. Well, one, it's from 2001, so it's very fashionably trying to be Saving Private Ryan for World War I, but on a A&E TV budget. So there's a lot of film flashes and shaky cam and massive incoherence of breaking the line. No one knows direction-wise what's happening. It also, TV movie has just some of the hoariest war cliches that the guy from Brooklyn talks to the guy from Montana and finds out they all alike after all. But it's funny how Pass of Glory from 1957 was way more modern than the 2001 Lost Battalion movie. But there's some flashy, interesting stuff in it. Not that, just a ripoff of Saving Private Ryan is still a ripoff of Saving Private Ryan. There's still going to be some interesting inspirations in there, and it did kind of feel like a movie that maybe Tony Soprano would really be watching. But the oddest movie of the week is a movie I didn't see for the first time. It was my third time seeing it, but it's the first time I got to see it intact. I drove down to the Belcourt, as I mentioned in the interview with Keegan DeWitt, to see The Keep, Michael Mann's misbegotten second theatrical feature, which the speaker beforehand gave a very impassioned speech about how it being a flawed movie, and then he talked in detail about the novels based on the script, and a lot of the holes are in the story. And if you've ever seen The Keep, it appears up on streaming platforms occasionally. That's where I first saw it, but I got to see a 35 millimeter print of it with the original Tangerine Dream score, and the Tangerine Dream score is one of those late 70s, early 80s issues where changing copyright laws means they'd had to keep the movie out of print, on top of the fact that Michael Mann's all but disowned the movie. And when you see the movie, you understand why. It's funny because I hadn't seen the movie probably in 10 years, and watching it again, I forgot. For some reason, I thought Michael Mann had Final Cut on it. And so I thought some of the bizarre, and I mean bizarre choices made in this movie were on purpose. And all what ended up happening was the movie got taken away from him. Michael Mann, who's a notorious spender, big budget movies, and he redevelops movies while he's still shooting them. This was a big budget fantasy movie that they pulled the plug on him pretty early, or at least capped him off. So a lot of his early ideas he had to go through with intact, including he worked with a special effects artist named Wally Veers, who had worked on 2001 and Superman, and he died 2 weeks into post-production. And so a lot of the effects, which like there's a sketch of a great effect in there, and there's a really interesting movie. And because the thing with this movie is massively incoherent. You have a scene where the main character, as the guy who spoke before the film pointed out, the main Scotland hero of the movie and the creature villain behind it don't have names until 4 minutes until the movie ends. And the hero has a tantric sex scene with the only woman in the movie after maybe exchanging 3 lines of dialogue and just meeting her in the middle of the movie. But all that being said, this is Michael Mann kind of doing a style that I have a odd fascination with, this early 80s Ridley the Scott brothers style. Like, this is the thing, whenever the British commercials or music video style kind of came to America, it involves a lot of smoke and hard light. It's the aesthetic that really influenced MTV, and the few features that come from it, like Blade Runner's like the biggest, the best of all of them, but things like The Hunger or even Legend. This is Michael Mann attempting to do that, and there are some instances where you see the possibilities that it could have, a more complete version might have been interesting at work. But the one thing you can say about any Michael Mann movie, the most unengaged one, is that there's not any lack of craft here. And clearly, like, the money, the time, the resources all left him. And it's unfortunate. As mentioned by the guy that spoke early in the movie, so hopefully there's a movie, documentary making of, being kickstarted right now that hopefully might come out this year. I am really interested in seeing it because The Keep, I can't recommend it, but it's pretty fascinating. Keegan DeWitt is on today's show, and I'm going to keep it short just because I think a lot of the reasons it's good that he was on here, and I was excited to have him on here. We talk about actually in the interview. I'm a big fan of his work, but not just his work, but his collaborations. He's doing some really interesting stuff right now with Alex Ross Perry and Aaron Katz and Brett Haley, and he's, as I mentioned earlier, he has a movie coming up on Netflix this week, All the Bright Places, which he says is his best work with Brett Haley. And as I go to in the conversation, I am an immense fan of him and Brett Haley's work on a movie called Hearts Beat Loud, which was one of my favorite movies for the last few years. And one of the things I come to the conclusion talking to him about is the thing I love about his work with all these directors is how organically, specifically with Haley and Alex Ross Perry, how organically the music becomes a part of the story, not just thematically, but a lot of the Brett Haley movies, including I'll See You in My Dreams and Hearts Beat Loud, like a song that he wrote, Keegan DeWitt wrote, becomes a plot point in the movies, and an emotional plot point too. So the song's got to be nailed on top of the fact that it's got to organically work into the movie. And he talks about his methods, how he came up, being also a big fan of Aaron Katz's first few movies. He talks about his pathway to being a composer whenever that wasn't originally what he planned. But I'm giving away the game. I hope you enjoy this interview. What are you working on today?
Today I'm working on a Quibi show for a director named Mary Herron, who I've worked with in the past. She did American Psycho, and then we did a film called Charlie Says together.
Oh, cool. I mean, how's working with Quibi? Like.
I mean, Quibi's fine. I'm more working on it because I enjoy Mary, and I think I try and make a priority out of working, at as many female collaborators and especially female directors as I can find. Quibi's, 10-minute long things that you watch on your phone. So I'm sure you can imagine how most of humanity feels about that, who's creating art. It's not
Sure.
the most exciting thing in the world.
Is it more wall to wall music, or is it just exactly the same in 10-minute spurts?
Uh, it's a lot of music because of the nature of what the show is. It's sort of like a horror thriller. Um, but yeah, it's fine. It's just like it's the whole thing. It's sort of like a trap door to get into talking about it because it's like I sort of disagree with the idea in general of creating content for a 10-minute mobile platform.
I
Um,
I know I've been talking a lot on here about it, that ambivalence, because you have children, right?
yeah,
Do you let them use smartphones?
no, I mean they'll use an iPad maybe once a week on the weekend for like an hour, but they're playing like educational games to learn how to code or like do math and
Oh,
things like that.
very cool. My nephew's doing coding right now. No, it's just you see kids how they're ingesting content right now, and I don't know if that's like Pandora's box might be open, but at the same time, like you said, anyone who's doing creative work right now just really is not interested in any of that. Um, so
I mean, it's also like you got to remember that for the creative industry, like especially for composers, like budgets have just gotten so stingy, and but the expectation is to deliver the same quality of product. And then when you shrink the length of the episodes, of course, they want to shrink the fees even more. So it just kind of gets to the point where it's like the only reason I'm really doing this project in general is because of Mary and because I believe in her and I'd like to continue working with her.
how long is
You know,
how long is the total content or the whole show?
it's like 120 minutes. I mean, that's the thing. It's like when they're trying to negotiate it with you, it's like, oh, it's only 10 minutes long. And you're like, right, but there's 12 of them. I can do the math. You know what I mean? So,
It's supposed to add up into make like a feature in 10-minute increments.
yeah, but they're acting like it's not. Like they're just being like, oh, it's easy. Like, oh, the episodes are 10 minutes. It's nothing. Because they're thinking about it, pricing it out like it's like a TV show where you're getting paid per length of episode, pretty much.
I guess they're technically still a startup, you're from Portland.
Yeah, I grew up in Portland.
How long did you stay in Portland?
I went to a fine arts high school there, or like sort of a crunchy alternative high school there that until I was 17 when I graduated, and then I went to New York to go to film conservatory and later actor conservatory.
Were your parents moviegoers?
Yeah. I mean, it was more that my parents were overall supportive of the arts and supportive of me kind of pursuing what I wanted.
Were you much of a moviegoer early on, or was it more music based?
I mean, I always did music, but more as like a hobby. I played in bands in junior high and stuff like that, and I always kind of like made my own music. But music for me, honestly, was always more like kind of like somebody keeps a journal or something like that. Like I would like record myself on a 4 track or do it. It was that kind of thing where it was very it was more like for my own personal kind of chronicling of stuff and my own experimentation. Really, like the thing that I was always super passionate about was screenwriting and playwriting and film. So when I was going to high school, I was had a really great writing mentor there who was essentially teaching me and one of my good friends that I still work with now, this director Aaron Katz. We both were in the same writing class and had the same writing mentor together.
Were you guys the same age?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm a big Aaron Katz fan. I mean, that's how I first actually came to your music too. But
Yeah.
so what were the movies growing up that you were into, or that got you into interested in screenwriting and playwriting?
I mean, the big movies that really like kind of expanded my brain as a teenager, like early teenager, were Thin Red Line by Terrence Malick and Boogie Nights by Paul Thomas Anderson. I think that those both sort of like set these weird like lane demarcations in my world. It was like, okay, one's like highly stylized, very much like one gear of filmmaking, and the other was like couldn't be more different. But they both came out essentially within a year of one another, and I just remember it being like a highly formative moment for my cinematic brain, just kind of especially Thin Red Line. Like I think that Boogie Nights like fed more into me as a teenager, being like, whoa, yeah, okay, this crazy long tracking shots and everything's over the top and it's all driven by music, and like that was very high school brain. But I remember sitting in the theater and watching Thin Red Line and just sort of being like, it's one of those things where you experience something that you're like, whoa, this is way more adult and wise and beyond me than I could have ever understood.
Did you pay much attention to Hans Zimmer score in it?
No, I didn't care about the score at all. I mean, honestly, I've only started listening to scores more concertedly in the past like 5 years. For
Really?
me, it was more about how they were telling the story.
Okay. Do you remember? I asked everyone this question. Do you remember your first movie?
Uh, no, not really. I mean, I remember. Yeah, I don't know. I just remember really being obsessed with Indiana Jones as a kid. Like I definitely loved like all these early adventure movies. But even then, like I don't, you know, it always seems so weird to me when people are like, "I love like movie soundtracks. I listen to movie soundtracks all the time." It just seems so strange to me. Um, and even now, like it's really hard for me to get into that kind of stuff. I mean, I get into it more when it's like more sort of modern contemporary stuff, like obviously Johnny Greenwood and Mika Levy and that kind of stuff. That's more to me like interesting and more listenable. But it would be hard for me. I mean, I really love and respect obviously everything that like John Williams and all these people are doing, but I probably wouldn't sit and want to listen to that score for me.
So, what were the bands like when you were a teenager?
I mean, I listened to a lot of punk rock. So for me, it was like the Clash and Minor Threat and a lot of this kind of political punk rock growing up. That was a big part of my life.
Okay.
And then that slowly started to morph kind of over time. Like and I think that like my junior high, early high school world was all skateboarding, punk rock, straight edge music, just crazy, as loud as possible. And
Straight edge
then,
music.
yeah, I've definitely listened to a lot of Earth Crisis and crazy things like that.
There's a
Uh,
lot of parallels, like between my hometown actually has a bizarrely decent punk scene, and for being such a small town, and between that and Thin Red Line, just wow, there's uh,
yeah.
man.
I mean, honestly, I wish that I would have spent a lot of those early formative years not listening to Earth Crisis. No offense to Earth Crisis, but it was just, I do wish that early on I had been a little bit more expansive in what I was listening to, but it is what it is. I mean, back then I was also like I think even then I was trying to really dig deeper. So I was, even though I was going to see Rancid live, I was listening to like Desmond Decker and Operation Ivy, and always trying to like sort of like dig a little like one or two generations earlier and figure out what was getting those people excited about making music. Um, and then later on I think that like once I discovered Oasis and later Blur, especially Damon Albarn, that really was like kind of opened my world into a much more melodic, like, oh shit, this is okay, I understand this now. Like, and then that started to gear me more toward like the idea of like songwriting and like the power of a song, and then early U2 and things like that. Like those were things like later in high school where I was like very much into Rattle and Hum, the U2 film, and things like that. Just starting to and during that, like my entire like late high school was like Brit pop, U2, that kind of world. And then once I kind of got out of school and stuff, then I started to turn more towards kind of through following Damon's world and then Gorillaz and stuff like that, discovering like Little Dragon and getting more into dance music and stuff. And then that's sort of what informed my like band world, was more like being fans of stuff like Wild Beasts and Little Dragon and stuff like that.
So, did you start out on guitar?
Kind of like I essentially, like as a little kid, my parents tried to get me to learn music multiple ways, and one was guitar and the other was piano. Sadly, both my guitar and piano teachers were more like, hey dude, let me teach you how to play a pop song that you like on this thing, rather than teaching me how to formally read and write music and stuff. So that's still like I'm slower than most composers in the world of like traditional reading and writing of music, but I kind of started on both.
Okay. Well, it just seems like
But
there's a lot of composers out there that movie composers who are really slow to get into doing. Like Tom York, I know was saying that he couldn't write music, and that was a big reason he didn't jump into until Suspiria.
yeah, I mean, for me, it's I always try and leverage things that seem like a weakness into something that's more of a strength. So it's like for me, because that's not my number one strength as a composer, I try to approach things more as a filmmaker and more as a sound designer and more as like, you know, I it's like although there's a highly technical side to something like what a cinematographer does with in terms of balancing f-stops and exposures and so on and so forth, at the same time they're dealing with like more abstract concepts of like how to use light to tell a story and create demarcate space and things in the frame. And so I'm trying to like sort of funnel that more as a composer and be like, well, I'm dealing with like light and shades, but they just happen to be musical light and shades rather than like, you know, it's like I'm very much not like a John Williams type composer where it's like, here's this melody and then let me modulate it and let me like transpose it into a new key and then subvert it here. Like I do a certain amount of that, but for me, it's not what gets me really excited or inspired as a composer. It's more being one part of many to create a film.
Okay. So Aaron Katz was one of the first people you worked with.
Yeah, I mean, me and Aaron were just buddies in high school, so we were both being like, "Holy shit, Boogie Nights!" and "Oh shit, Thin Red Line," and getting excited about all this stuff. And so we were just kind of feeding off each other. I actually went to film school a year before him because I graduated a year early, and so there would be a lot of stuff of like, you know, I'd be calling him from school, being like, "Oh my god, we just watched this Fred Wiseman documentary," and then he'd be like, running and renting it, and then calling me back the next day and talking about it, or he'd be discovering something and calling me, and so we really like started to kind of like fall in love with discovering films and digging into the world of all these different filmmakers together.
Where'd you go to
A lot
school?
of I went to SUNY Purchase in New York. They've got like a conservatory program for filmmaking there.
Okay. Um, so he came out a year later.
Yeah, he came out a year later and went to North Carolina School of the Arts, where, ironically, like a bunch of his roommates were we kind of all just became friends. I would come and visit him at school, or somehow we just all got involved, and that's where I met Chad Hartigan, who's another person that I made films with, and later Brett Haley, who also went to North Carolina School of the Arts. So
I didn't know
we
that.
just yeah, so we all just kind of got connected early on and came up together.
Okay. Then so Dance Party USA was your first feature score, or was there a doc before then?
No, I think that was it. I mean, and that's not even really a score. It's just like Aaron called me and was like, "Hey, my film got into South by Southwest. You do music. Could you try and do music to it?" So, I mean, at that point, I had no idea of film composing or wanting to be a film composer. I just kind of like, you know, tinkered around and did some stuff on my laptop and sent it to him. So that was very early on.
So was bands and film going the priority when you were first in New York?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I first went to New York, I was in film school. So at that point, I thought I was going to be, writing and directing films. And then I later went to acting conservatory, but that was more because I was trying to sort of understand the craft of acting as a director and stuff. But I was always kind of doing music, as my like I was saying, like it was kind of my private thing that I enjoyed doing. And I guess I was sort of making a half-hearted attempt to do music stuff, but never really thinking about it like that. And certainly not thinking of myself really as a film composer or anything like that. It really took Cold Weather, the next film that we did together, and then a couple other things to start to sort of take root where I was like, oh, this makes sense. Like, I don't really enjoy the world of like, band songwriter world, and I don't totally know if I want to be like a director of films, at least at that point. And so I was like, this is kind of like the perfect harmony of these two things where I can like very much be a filmmaker, but do it with music.
Well, it's
And
interesting to hear you say that because I mean I like Dance Party USA. I watched a little bit of it again last night. I hadn't seen it in years, but Quiet City is actually was a really big inspiration. And I mean, I guess I forget how much music you had in there, but I mean, I thought there was more than there was in Dance Party.
yeah, I don't know, but that I guess it's a good point. And that Quiet City was the beginning of me sort of understanding minimalist piano music and being excited. And that was like essentially the beginning of me being like, huh, film composing. What is this? You know,
Okay.
and exploring people like, you know, Michael Nyman and Steve Reek and other people like that. It was just kind of being like, okay, this is interesting. It's trying to wrap my head around what kind of film composer I could be,
Mm.
you know?
When did you start messing around with synths?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, I think that it's like I've always been drawn to the computer because it's super flexible and I can like really manipulate sounds and really, you know, I can collage create things. I really am like a collage oriented composer where I like to be able to take things and turn them inside out and reverse them and re-record them and, you know, build things out like I would a scrapbook or something like that.
Did you ever do much editing in film school?
I did a little bit of editing, yeah. I mean, and I certainly learned a lot about it through my film studies classes and stuff as I started to learn about the history of filmmaking and stuff. But yeah,
Well, it's we'll get to this later, but I'm kind of back into like doing more, or just playing around with musical stuff now, and a lot of the reasons I'm getting to it is just because as an editor, I know a nonlinear timeline, and a lot of the software available to us just seems like doing sound design sometimes, and I can look at it as opposed to a performance as something I can just lay out.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I think that it's like that. You know, that goes further to talking about like composing more as a filmmaker than as like a strict music theory kind of place in terms of just being like uh, oftentimes like I'm not sitting just writing that like lead melody and being like, well, what happens when I throw these chords beneath it, and what happens if I change it around here? It's more like really getting in the computer and just creating like a folder full of crazy different ideas, and then throwing that up against picture and being like, oh, this is interesting. You know what I mean? Like this sort of brings something to life. I mean, I've become more traditional now as I kind of, you know, my skills evolve and I get better at what I do. I'm more I think it's funny that I sort of like started at such an improvisational place, and now I'm kind of yearning to do more kind of like themes and development of themes and so on and so forth. But um, I don't know. It's interesting. It's for me as I move forward. It's always a concerted effort to try and keep a certain amount of the amateurism and the improvisational, instinctive stuff that is what was so critical to my curiosity and passion about things early on, while still really, really working every day to expand my craft and get better at doing things like themes and stuff like that. Because I feel like, you know, it's easy to be cynical about, you know, a director being like, well, it'd be great to have like a, you know, Susie's theme and Tim's theme, and then when they come together, they interplay, and you're sort of like, oh, Jesus, you know. But then you do it, and you get in there and you start laying these things into picture, and you realize that there's a reason why it's so prevalent, and it's because it's an extremely powerful tool, and you can, if you do it correctly and with taste and with real love, it can be something that's extremely powerful.
It can sometimes be so conceptual and a crutch too, though, where directors just really stuck on it and they think it's solving a problem, and all it's not. But so are you so are you? I mean, I guess it sounds like the arc is that do you just kind of like send your tracks to the editor and director and let them place it in when you're just getting your first ideas, or are you doing more first spotting sessions now?
It really depends on the nature of the relationship, right? So if it's me and Aaron, that, or me and Chad, or any of these friends that I've really done a bunch of films with, it's super wide open, and it's like, how exciting can it be? Let's do something crazy, and it's just like me experimenting and us getting together and getting excited about it. Whereas, you know, now, where because of where I am in my career, there's a lot more traditional things where I'm hired onto a show and there's 10 different producers, and when we go to meet, it's like a bunch of different personalities in the room, and 80% of my job is navigating and managing all those different personalities and opinions, and 20% is composing. You know, I don't mean that in a cynical like, oh, and the composing's bad. I just mean, you know, it's a different
No,
skill set.
I'm shaking my head and just post this. Like it's like you said, the amateurism is what you're going with, and like I've always struggled with this idea of like when you growing up in love with film, no one told you that so you probably should have gotten a second degree in psychoanalysis. Like
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's hard, but honestly, I'm. It's still like a matter of even then you can subvert the idea of themes. I mean, use them to your power. I mean, it's like now as I work on a project and there are 10 personalities in the room. One of the benefits of having themes and having a structure and saying like these are our themes that we're using is if suddenly somebody wants to like turn the whole turnip truck over with some crazy idea, you can be like, well, this is not, or or if they suddenly like have some crazy idea, you can be like, well, we put a lot of work into establishing these themes. Let's learn how to work within this. You know what I mean? Like you can use those as a, for me, it's like it helps scope creep because I can be like, well, it's sort of weird that why in the like fourth reel would we just suddenly have a brand new, totally unrelated piece of music that doesn't is not relating to these characters. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I didn't mean to completely badmouth like a bunch of producers because the other thing I found, especially if I'm not in charge anymore, is how much more faith I have in the collaboration. You always want to make everyone happy, and you want these different personalities and ideas, especially if they're smart. Like you want more smart people on a movie, giving you ideas and trying to make you see what the movie could be too. Um,
Well, I think the thing that is the biggest takeaway is that, and I have had to learn to do this as a collaborator in general, and I wish that more producers would do this. And I think the thing that you're sort of hinting at that gets lost as soon as you have 10 people in a room is remembering that you've hired people who are extremely talented to do what they're good at. And
yeah,
you've got to figure out how to let them do what they're good at. And often that gets lost. It's like when it's always good to remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do as a collaborator is just not say anything and not have any notes. Sometimes notes are incredibly great and really good. Most of the time they are. But, it's like for me, sometimes I'll get to a point on bad projects or troublesome projects where I'll have to say like, uh, guys, it's hard for me to really say right now because you've pushed me so far out of the element of what I know how to do. And sometimes that's good. Sometimes I find myself there and I'm like, wow, I've done work that I would have never done otherwise. But other times I find myself being like, I'm sort of in a zone where it's hard for me to have any opinion about this work that I'm doing because I've sort of let myself get bullied by these 10 different people and I'm not doing the work that they hired me to do anymore.
that's interesting. Especially like, how many projects are you bouncing usually right now at one time?
I
Or
mean, now yeah, talk about the like looking back on the days when I was great. It's like, when I did Cold Weather, it was the only film I did that year. And it was great, and it was the only thing I thought about. Where now it's like at one time I'm working on probably three different TV shows. I'm in the tail ends of one movie, in the meat of a second movie, and probably getting sort of like intense emails from the movie that's about to happen, saying, "Hey, here's what we want. Here's what we're thinking. When can we have some of your attention span?"
wow, I mean, yeah, I mean, I just it's hard for me. I mean, I guess I can maybe picture it, but I mean, editors obviously rarely are doubling up. So, um,
Yeah.
what were the big changes on Cold Weather when you first started really seeing this as a the just everything coming together with what you want to do, or was it a bigger budget? Did you have more expanded things you were working with?
I think it was more. I mean, I don't know. It was like, gosh, it's probably more than 10 years ago now. But at that point, it was like it was just our first grown-up movie. Like with Quiet City and Dance Party, we were just sort of like kids making movies like you would make them. You know what I mean? Like it was the college. It wasn't even like film school level movies. Almost. It was like run and gun, shooting it, like cutting it on your laptop in your apartment kind of thing. Where this was like, we had our production offices and the editing suite and all that stuff, and you sort of have that thing where you're like, oh, I'm serious now. I'm a composer. But it was great, and then we got to like really sit and like score two scenes, and I was like. I sort of had my room next to Aaron's room, and I would like come up with something and take it over, and we'd watch it and be like, "Oh, that's cool. Let's do these changes." And I'd jump back in my room and back and forth. So that was really nice, in that it was sort of a glimpse at what was to come in terms of being like, oh, this is like a grown-ass composing process, and we're really working through it, and it's really
I mean,
exciting.
yeah, I mean, like part of what I always thought was inspiring about Quiet City is that it wasn't a quotation mark real movie and like that. I mean, I know I'm always trying to get back to that, trying to make that fingerprints and the amateurism. Like it's always something like I feel like I'm struggling to try to constantly get into it. Um,
Well, totally. I mean, that continues on. It's like even on me and Chad Hartigan are finishing a movie right now, and that's we came up with a score on that we're really proud of, but it's a little bit of a challenging score. and we've had to go to bat with the producers just to say like, hey, please give us the bandwidth to like bring this thing into the world how it is, because we think that it, like you're saying, it resembles like our first instinct rather than like how can we make sure that this movie
Can
sells.
can you talk about that score? What you're doing with it?
Yeah, I mean it's more that it's just the choices that we made with it. Like, it's like in general with a movie, producers have this is not isolated to this project, but producers are always worried about pacing and about I don't know. Like to talk about it in the context of a different movie, right? Like Beale Street, I think is a great example of a score where it's like it's moody and it's beautiful, and as soon as you like the first scenes of Beale Street, you just feel transported into this world and like suspended, and it's because obviously the filmmaking is beautiful, but the score is so beautiful,
Yeah.
and I could very easily see bad producers being like, uh, like, oh, it's a period piece. Like, where? Oh, and there's like black people in this movie, and like we want to be like super woke white producers. So like, why is there not like funk music? And like, how can we make it feel super like vibey and paced out? You know what I mean? And it's just that kind of thing where you have to fight for those choices to say like, no, we want this film from the very first frame to feel like almost a dream.
Okay.
And those things are really hard to fight for as a composer, and I'm sure as an editor too.
Well, I know I've complained to other editors about how if a post is going bad, that we might be on the chopping block to be fired. But if I'm being honest, it's more, especially with producers, composers are the ones that usually are on the chopping block first, because when no one can analyze what's wrong with a movie, the first thing they're like, let's change the score.
Yeah. I mean, I just had a film literally 2 weeks ago where some producer and director called me who are friends, and they're like, hey, can you watch this? Like, we're thinking of firing our composer. Can you give me, like, you just give us your advice about it? And I watched it and I was like, honestly, I mean, they're my friends, so I could be honest, but I was just like, your first 15 minutes need to be 5 minutes long. It's like, this is an editorial thing. Like, you just don't have the footage,
Yeah.
And like, I was just like that kind of thing where it's like no composer can fix the fact that the first 15 minutes of your movie have like 2 4-minute long dialogue driven scenes that have mild pacing problems. Not for It's like that's natural, that happens with every movie, but it just so happens that in this case it's in the first like 15 minutes, and so those things can be difficult where it's like no composer can fix that unless you just suddenly want to have him like put like shakers and like some cheesy ass broad music beneath it, which
Just
then
up the
like,
tempo artificially.
yeah, so it's kind of like a lot of times I feel like, and that's not to like say that composers don't, shouldn't, their music shouldn't be revisited at some point. But I mean, as I think everybody figures out in this business, like if you made it to the point where you're regularly getting hired, you're pretty competent at what you can do, and it's just a matter of people effectively communicating with you,
Do you
to get you there.
do you feel comfortable getting editorial suggestions, or is that a case by case basis?
If I'm on the project, I always sort of try and take the tack that like it's one thing if I were speaking directly to the editor in isolation, I could be like, "What do you like? What's going on with this scene? Like, seems like God, if we could get from the car to the house sooner or something like that, Because then it's like two peers talking. But I always take the tack in general if there's producers or other people around that unless it's someone explicitly asks or it's really an important thing, I'm not going to comment in a way that creates more work or more stress for somebody else on the project.
That's cool.
Maybe I learned that because that happens to me a lot, where like someone will
Yeah.
just offhandedly be like, hey, I'm not the composer, but like what happens if we like score this 8 minute long super complicated scene? I know we probably won't use it, but let's just try. And I'm like sitting over there being like, dude, you just created so much work for me.
You know what? I think I've been really lucky in that regard, where like the extra work sometimes I'm like, fine. I'm an editor. I'll try to throw everything on the wall and see what sticks. But I've really only had like maybe once or twice where a collaborator, somebody else in another department, said something that was actually very personal about like I don't think he's doing it right or something like that. I've only had that happen once, and I was so offended by it. I think I've been lucky in that regard.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. It's hard because you realize that so much of effective collaborations is just the people. You know, it's like really with bad movies or troublesome movies, you can make them pretty darn good if all the people have pro attitudes and are considerate and thoughtful about how they speak to people and stuff. It's just like, you know, like we said before, like so much of the working in the industry is just navigating intense, rude, or sort of like tricky personalities and figuring out how to kind of still create good work out of all that.
Yeah, or passionate, or alternately in different ones. So how did you hook up with Alex Ross Perry?
Again,
How
through
did you?
Chad and Aaron, they're just all they were just kind of like all friends through film festival world and having met and you know just common friends. And so when Alex was doing God, what was the first thing we did? Oh, Listen Up Philip. He was like, Alex has got a movie, you should meet Alex. And I just remember, you know, that Alex, like knowing about Alex just from a very peripheral place, I was like, he seems like a very opinionated guy. um, and then we met and we just got along really well. It's a weird friendship that we have. I think that it's like I really defer to him and respect what he does because I think what he does is so singular and interesting. And he really extends me a lot of respect. And it's like we just always have great collaborations. I mean, mainly because he has the one that he has, and him and Chad and a lot of these people, and maybe it's because they come from friendships first rather than just meeting on a professional level. But they all have this one thing, which is they get to the composing phase that involves music and they're willing to be brave enough to be like, this music could totally change my entire movie in a way that I didn't expect it to, you know?
Yeah.
And like, I never blame filmmakers for this, as I totally understand where they're coming from. But a lot of filmmakers, you know, spend the entire time having to fight off bad opinions and pushy people and you know rude producers or whoever it is. And so by the time they get to the composing the music part, they're so close to being done that they're like, I know how my music's going to be, or my movie's going to be, and I just want to get it done now. You know what I mean? And so it's really hard to get them to do something crazy or revolutionary or really wild with the music. They sometimes will say that they want to do that, but then it becomes quickly clear that they don't. Where with Alex and Chad and Aaron, these guys, they're really like, it's yet another exciting chapter of like, wow, this could totally change things. You know, the movie could feel totally different by the time we're done with this, which is really exciting.
Do you have any strong opinions on temp music?
I mean, it's more that it's just always better, and I'm sure editors agree with this and filmmakers agree. Like everybody agrees with this, which is it would be awesome to always have music before you start cutting the movie, or before you even start shooting the movie. You know, just like from script phase, it would always be great. Sadly, it doesn't work that way because of scheduling and everybody like gets busy. Um, but yeah, temp music is hard. Temp music is really hard, but I sort of reserve judgment to hate on it explicitly because I just don't see how editors are supposed to do their jobs without it. You know, I respect editors who can do their jobs without it up to a certain degree, you know, because I know a lot of editors really pride themselves on saying like, I want to cut dry to know that it works and then start bringing in music, which I appreciate.
Yeah.
It's more just that everybody uses the same temp music, you know, and yes, once it's in there, it's really hard to get rid of it,
The
you
last
know.
the last project I worked on, my friend, I was just helping out a friend, and I started realizing half the reason he's doing good work is because he's keeping a beat on scores, and he's varying up his what temps he puts in. He's not using the exact same one because the assembly we worked on used some very recognizable ones, and it just immediately threw you out of the movie completely.
Well, and more than anything, it's just like once you hear Under the Skin or a scene, you can't create another cue that's going to not be like that but still achieve the same thing. It's really hard, you know. That's such a credit to her work on that. Or same with, you know, Cliff Martinez in every single documentary ever made. You know,
Yeah.
it's just like these things are like they're incredible scores and they're great, but like you know, for example, I worked on a doc recently where it was like it was very clear that they had a great idea of what the music would be, and it spanned a bunch of modern composers, both you know more formal composers and then film composers and classical composers, and it was just like such a thrill to work on it. It was like, oh yeah, not all temp is bad if it can be really expansive and exciting and interesting, because then it's more when you know you get the film that they've temped it all with one score, you know.
Well, what's funny you mentioned Under the Skin because I remember I used Cold Weather as a temp on one movie, and what was weird was the director put it in the project, and I hadn't really heard, really wasn't that familiar with the music. And what had a problem was we had different tones going back and forth, and so
Yeah.
we alternated between Under the Skin and Cold Weather, and it never tonality solved the movie. And was
Yeah.
funny was when I later came to listen to or saw Queen of Earth, I was like, oh, that music would have been so much better.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard. I don't envy editors at all in that way, but it is something that I always try and do, which is like forge a relationship with the editor because it is so make or break. It's like the editor can get you a job out of thin air by placing your music in there and proving how great it can work against picture. But if you have an editor who does not care about having a relationship with you and is trying to just please other people, it can be extremely hard to succeed at your job, because I've had certain jobs where you're sending music and it's like just not getting in the cut. Or if it's getting in there, it's getting placed in a weird way or something like that. So I try to really like forge a relationship with the editor because, we're doing a lot of the same work in a weird way.
So, back to the Queen of Earth score. Was that Under the Skin influenced, or because I mean, the interesting thing to me was the atonalities in there, and just like it seemed like it's a big
I
push.
had a urge Under the Skin at that point. I think that whole score really just sprung from those bells that I had found
Mm.
that it were so interesting and atonal and had so much character. And like for me as a composer, anytime you can find a singular instrument that can achieve that much depth and dynamic with such simple performance, you're like, whoa, this is powerful. Because I spend so much other time as a composer layering this thing and that, and I've got three violins and all the cellos and stuff, and so it's like it can be really exhilarating when you find like a single bell that just like literally playing anything on it and just doing it, even a bell hit every 30 seconds. You're like, whoa, this is interesting,
Always trying to keep it as simple as possible.
Yeah.
So when did you move to Nashville?
I was probably like 25 at the time. I had moved to New York to, do filmmaking, got into filmmaking and acting school. And by the time I finished all that stuff, I spent maybe a year or so where I was just doing what everybody who's like 24, 25 in New York does, which is like hustle to make money and pay your rent. And I just had a moment where I was like, I'm never going to accomplish what I want to do here because to be able to afford to live here, I'm having to work like a full-time job and do, I just was like, I felt myself slowly being sucked down that path to 10 years later, looking back and being like, oh man, I wish I would have done some of those things I actually wanted to do, but now I manage hotels and restaurants or something. You know what I mean? Like whatever it was.
I was
And
going to ask what
so
was your day job in New York or day
I
jobs.
mean, I had a great day job. I worked with this really amazing guy named Eric Good, who was like a nightclub guy in the 80s. And we built and opened really cool hotels like the Maritime Hotel and the Bowery Hotel and the Lafayette House and all these really interesting places. I mean, I was getting to meet really incredible people and get really, I mean, it was a really great way to experience New York. But it was my full time world, So at that point, I kind of left being like, I don't remember why. I think I was just kind of burnt out from being in acting school and film school for so long that I was like, I'm gonna go and do music stuff, with the full breadth of my abilities because I knew that it was cheap to be in Nashville, but that Nashville still was like this weird triangulation between New York and LA, and that it had a viable entertainment industry where I could really do it, and it just kind of worked out nicely at that point.
Um, no, it's funny. When we are scheduling this, I mentioned I got something going tonight. I'm driving to Nashville to go see a movie at the Belcourt tonight.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Did you ever go to the Belcourt?
Yeah, all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a special feature on the Cold Weather DVD of us performing some of the score live at the Belcourt.
Oh, that's super super cool. So I wanted to move on to Brett Haley. Your first movie feature with him was "I'll See You in My Dreams."
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So you guys have did you the song at the end is a significant part of the movie. Like is he just put a slug in the script saying you're going to write something, or how does that work out?
He just kind of was like, "Man, it'd be great if you could write something," but it would, mainly because at that point in my career, I was like, both doing film composing, but also writing songs, and was in my band and stuff. So he was kind of like, well, it'd be great to get a song for the end credits. And then we just sort of started a habit of that, if that makes any sense.
But I mean, it's the one that he plays at the end on the ukulele, isn't it?
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. So, sorry, this is my bad memory. That, I mean, I guess we knew that we had to have the song. So we kind of, composed it for that. But we've continued to do that. I mean, there's an original song on The Hero, and then there's a song. I guess there isn't a song for All the Bright Places, but then there is a song in this new film that we just finished called Sort of Like a Rock Star.
Okay. Well, I do. The one of the big reasons I wanted to talk to you is, and I every once in a while on a podcast I do this like volcanic geeking out on a certain movie, but Hearts Beat Loud was just blew my mind when I saw it. I adored it. Yeah. And especially the sequence, I was raving to all my friends. I was like, this is the sequence of the year, is that part where the cue Everything Must Go plays.
Yeah.
And I just remember telling him, I was like, this, I mean, some of it was a storytelling, but some of it was your music and just how I knew, we were talking about motifs earlier, and, a lot of times you want them to just be as simple as possible, but, like, I remember thinking it was kind of like the end of second act thing they're always trying to get into musicals, whether it's like, the one, was it One Day More in Les Mis, or the Little Resistance Blame Canada thing in South Park, where at the end of the second act, you're trying to bring everything together. But like in Hearts Beat Loud, that scene that montage just works on so many different levels, and it's where that movie turns into a musical. But at the same time, such a simple musical.
Well, that's actually funny because it's credit also to my collaborator in my band, Wild Cub, this guy Jeremy Bullock, who we wrote that song together. I wrote a bunch of the songs in the film, and then Jeremy and I worked together on that song, and he came up with that lead guitar line that's on top of that. That's like such a great thing to send it off.
I mean, I also mentioned in spirit of geeking out, like for me hitting early onset midlife crisis, I was like trying to play more music. Like I hadn't played really since I played in bands in high school, and like bought a guitar, and that lick I like made sure to try. It's like the first thing I've tried to teach myself to play since high school. And
that's great.
I bugged a bunch of composer friends. I was like, what programs am I using? I want to start messing around with synths. I want to start doing stuff. Like that movie really jump started of like music should be an expression in everyone's life to some degree.
I mean, it makes me happy to hear you say that, mainly because I remember when Brett was like, I want to make a movie about like recording and all this stuff, and he was like asking me about like the scene when they record the song for the first time. And I just remember, to me, I'm like, sounds boring, man. I do that every day. And I was like, I mean, I'll trust you that I guess it's interesting to watch people record something on the computer. And he's like, oh, yeah, man. People will love this. And I was like, okay.
That sure. The title song is from your EP. There's a solo EP, Nothing Shows.
Yeah.
So he just took the song and then made a screenplay around it?
Yeah, we were at Sundance for The Hero, and he was like, it was literally the day after The Hero premiere. This is very on brand for Brett, but it was like the day after the premiere of The Hero, and he was like, all right, man, so I got the next movie, like, Hearts Beat Loud, and he sort of pitched me this idea. And honestly, it sort of hit me at a time where I had the least amount of interest in writing something like Hearts Beat Loud, mainly just because I had just done 2.5 years of touring the entire world with my band, Wild Cub. Like, we had a song on the radio that took us everywhere. And I sort of, like, that entire experience was like, I loved the people in the band, and I loved the experience of getting to take that song around the world and do all the things that we did with it. But being involved in that part of the music industry, I was just, by the time it was done, I was like, get me out of here, man. I don't want to do this anymore. So when he was like, I literally just sort of like moved to LA and got settled and was really doing film composing full time. And he was like, it was almost like he cracked the door on a time machine and was like, do you want to go back to when you were in the band writing songs? So at first I was kind of like, man, I don't know. And then I started writing stuff and writing more and more. And it just helped that in a nice way, it sort of like transitioned me fully out of that world and allowed me to like begin writing songs again in a way that was more for me in a fun way. So that's like,
is Wild Cub still a thing?
No, Wild Cub is not a thing anymore.
Okay. Well, what's funny is I just started listening to it in prep for this interview, and I remember kind of drawing a line between kind of the like big anthemic choruses that like were kind of one of those things that make you excited in Hearts Beat Loud, but it also I don't know if like between Let It Snow and the new movie that's playing on Netflix soon. I mean,
All the bright.
is it does it help with like young adult stuff too, or is it something you're trying to creep into all scores, or is it just a natural expression that comes out?
What, like the bigger the? Well, I mean, I think that for me, like I was saying, talking about like really loving Rattle and Hum as a kid, like that to me was like the power of pop music and how like like a 3.5 minute song can really like affect you in a deep transformative way and like make you feel like you're like floating above the earth, you know.
Yeah.
And so that was the thing that always, that's why Wild Cup exists pretty much, is because I was really excited about the idea of capturing this feeling of like just, I don't know, magic in a bottle for 3.5 minutes, you know. It really worked out in a very poetic, awesome way for me. And then I like met my soon to be wife, wrote a song about her. The song succeeded at radio, and we got to spend like 2.5 years traveling the world meeting people who loved the song because they had also met the person they were, you know what I mean? I was very lucky in that way. Um, but I do think that like for composing and stuff, yeah, I think that like when I talk about like the improvisational aspect of it, it's like that feeling of trying to capture a little bit of that as well. I mean, this film that we have coming out next, whatever it is, the 28th, All the Bright Places. I mean, that's definitely the best work that I've done, I think, and it's um, me and Brett's best work to date, and that it feels like that. I mean, I hope that when people watch that film, it really feels both deeply moving, but the music is the kind of thing where like as soon as you turn it on, you're taken back there immediately.
I the last movie I worked on was real the just was helping out my friend. I'm guessing it's the newer one you guys are finishing up, but the Brett Haley was in the editing the same suite we were editing in.
Oh, okay.
I think it's in oh I forget the name it was in, but it was in kind of
That's a whole other movie called Sort of Like a Rock Star.
okay.
His, I mean, Brett is prodigious in a great way. He's a hustler and constantly making movies. So we're like, we made all the bright places over a year ago. I think we recorded the chamber orchestra at Capitol this time over a year ago, probably. So it's been waiting to come out because of different scheduling stuff with that for Elle Fanning, but now it's finally here. We're really excited.
Um, I did want to really talk to you about her smell though, because it seems like a reoccurring thing is that with you is that the music really integrates within with the storytelling. But I mean, how much was he asking? Like, you guys, it was a band Bully from Nashville. You guys worked with for some of the songs.
Oh yeah, well, so kind of per what I was saying about the Hearts Beat Loud stuff. This was pretty recent, almost the same time, shortly after. And Alex was like, "Do you want to write a bunch of original songs for Her Smell, for the band and Her Smell?" And first, I was just like, "No, I'm burnt out on writing songs." But also, I was like, "This is like a band of women, and it would be cool if we could have a woman write these songs." So I knew Alicia from Nashville, and I was like, "She's perfect for this." So that worked out really amazing, which is great, and she's incredible. Um, and then for the score, yeah, I mean, just all the stuff with me and Alex, like anytime we do a score, I think it's similar to like Aaron, right? Where like as soon as we did Cold or Quiet City and Cold Weather, we were kind of addicted. Like we realized like, whoa, score can really be significant in how we make this film. And so each time we approach it, it's not just like, cool, what do you think musically? It's like, dude, what's the music gonna be? Like this is cool. Like what are we gonna do here? And I think it's very similar with Alex, where it's like because of Listen Up, Fill Up, and then Queen of Earth, it was like, oh, music can really transform this stuff. And so we just had this idea that we wanted it to feel like a panic attack the entire time.
It definitely did. I mean, you're putting your finger on what I like love about you guys' stuff is just because like a lot of stuff when you have these collaborations, like you're getting bolder and bolder, but at the same time it's organic to the story, or to the film itself. It's not, it's tricky sometimes when you swing for the fences and you try up a crazy temp idea music wise, and
Yeah.
and it's one thing to make a scene work with a crazy idea, but then to make a whole score work with a crazy idea is just, that's the reason why people don't do it as commonly, it seems like.
I agree. Well, also, a good example is like with me and Aaron, like on Gemini, I remember we had an entire score for that film that just didn't work. Like, it was a great score. I still have it in a folder, and like people who have gone to the test screenings are like, dude, you got to email me the old Gemini score. Like, do you have it? And
What did it
I
sound like?
at the time it was, you know, a lot of Gemini's inspiration was like these 90s VHS feelings, like very early 90s. And so we built a bunch of stuff that was very like synthy and VHS feeling, and really interesting and steamy and kind of gritty. And I think it didn't help that right around that time Stranger Things came out, which we were like, oh, this is going to be bad, because even though our stuff is different than this, it's going to get lumped in, because we just knew by the time our movie came out there was going to be like 6 other scores that had been more derivative of that, you know, and ours was close enough in a world, Tangerine Dream wise and Escape from New York wise, that kind of stuff, where we were like, oh, I don't know. And also it just wasn't working. It was great, but it was like the first opening. Like, now there's a great opening cue in Gemini, is that pans down from the palm trees and there's sort of this trap beat and this steamy feeling. But previously the score that was there made you feel like there was about to be a fucking Ferrari blazing past and there's going to be a car chase or something. You know, it was like dun, 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 dun. It just felt crazy, and the movie never really went there in terms of the pacing. And so we had this moment where it was like literally Aaron pacing around and I was like laying on my back in the editing suite, and we were just like, what's it gonna be? And we just decided to like take the entire score and throw it away and start over again.
Did that premiere at South by?
I have no idea.
Because
I don't remember.
I was at a early screening at South by, but I don't know if it started there. But that's the only time I've ever met Aaron Katz, and I remember meekly going up to him and being like, I like Quiet City a lot. Thanks for making a movie.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really remember the ride of it, but I do remember being proud of that Gemini score, mainly because it was the first real test of the like, yeah, it's easy to make scores with your friends, but what happens when like the rubber hits the road and you have to like throw it all away? And it was like, and we made it work. It worked out.
I live off test screens. I know they get such a bad rep, but like it's the only time you're like, look, we got somebody else here that's like, you felt the reactions in the room. You know if this thing's working or not. You may not be able to pick it out why it isn't working, but you know it is or isn't working.
It's so weird with a test screening, because often the things you learn in a test screening as a composer, editor, director, you know before the talkback.
You know before the what was that?
You don't even need you know sort of the vibe before the talkback even happens. You don't even have to read the cards. It's weirdly this thing where like as soon as the lights go down, you can just feel the vibe in the room and how it's being received, and it's I think really helpful.
I had one last her smell question. The Bryan Adams song, was that? I mean, I assume that was just in the script already.
That was something Alex was really passionate about, and I like recorded a little tutorial for Lizzie about how to play it on piano, and she just killed it.
Did you have to teach Nick Offerman guitar?
Jeremy did that. Jeremy, the bandmate who I said wrote that guitar part. Mainly because, you know, I may have played guitar a lot in my life. I am still a shitty guitar player. I'm like the perfect example of somebody who, both at piano and guitar, I play just well enough to accomplish exactly what I need to accomplish and nothing beyond that.
Okay. Moving on to the TV stuff, you're working on some cool stuff. Like I see a Teacher, the TV show adaptation, and Sorry for Your Loss. Yeah. Like you did. How many episodes of the OA did you do?
I just did the series finale, the very last one.
I mean, what's that like, having to produce that much more content?
I mean, I enjoy it, honestly, because the filmmaking process can be so like bloated or, you know, go on forever. It's just a little bit less clear, you know, especially depending on the scale of the process. And that I kind of like maybe it's the OCD part of me, but I enjoy spotting a locked episode on a Wednesday and having to, you know, have a revision or like deliver it essentially a week later. It's like.
Do you have to like I mean, is it something where you're reusing a lot of the same cues over and over and just modulating them differently? All the leitmotif stuff you were talking about that you'd have to.
I wish it were true. I mean, it is sort of true. It happens a little bit, but maybe I just have bad luck and get shows that don't do that as much. But that's at least how they pitch it to you. And I mean, by season 2, yeah, it gets better. But you know, you got to remember that now, like, you know, because of Netflix, stuff doesn't go 4 or 5 seasons anymore, really. So that's definitely true by season 3, 4, 5, 6, where you're just reusing music. But when a lot of these shows only go for 2 seasons, it's tough.
Well, it's funny, the examples you made earlier of like commonly using cues. Granted, it's a few years ago, but you like Under the Skin, and I know I've used the Nick score a few times with Cliff Martinez,
Yeah.
and like you recognize same things coming up, but at the same time, obviously, it's like just such a load of content that he's having to produce.
Yeah, I mean, it is nice in that you don't overthink every single cue, and if you're working with the right collaborators, it's just like you get to explore more minutia narratively as a filmmaker and a writer and a director. You can, as long as the producers don't drive you totally crazy, you can do the same composing wise, where you can just sort of like cast a broader net. You know what I mean? And do more rhythmic, long form stuff, and it can be good depending on the scenario.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I got. I just want to thank you. It was an absolute pleasure to like talk to you about some of this stuff. Like some of the work you're doing, the work you're doing with some of these directors is really just on the pulse of something really, really cool right now.
Dude, I really appreciate it. It means a lot. Especially coming from an editor. It's a high compliment.
Yeah. Keegan DeWitt, I want to thank you for being on the podcast.
All right, man.
Thanks, man.